and welcome to this video from zonalaudio.com. This is part 2 of a series where we are essentially creating a full track from absolutely nothing. The first video showed essentially a experimental sound design session where we created and recorded all sorts of crazy noises, which we are now going to turn into the track that you heard in the intro. So first thing to do was to find a suitable piece of audio to be used as a kick drum. And then there's a significant amount of trial and error in terms of setting up pitch and filter envelopes to really get the kick drum sound. This kind of process can be extremely beneficial to both new and experienced producers of just creating a kick from the ground up. You can really design it exactly how you want it. You'll see there's lots and lots of processing that goes into this. One thing that's interesting about this kick design is actually the keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed there is a bit of a skew on the left-right balance of the sound. The sound design that we did was very stereo. We were using the Echo plugin. We had Reverb on there, doing lots of effects that were modulating the delay times on both the left and right channels. So when starting to make a kick, we have to be aware that our signal is quite stereo. This isn't something that concerned me too much, certainly in the initial stage of creating the sound. There is a moment where we cut out the sides using the mid-side option of EQ8. This video is going to be pretty long format, largely unedited. There is times when we are doing more session admin and we've just sped up these moments. You can see at present here we're using an envelope follower on node 4 of the EQ8, and this is to try and give a bit of a pump and a thumping sound to the kick. So we're going to add raw here for more saturation. terms of kick design, it is a pretty repeatable process to go EQ, saturation, EQ, more saturation and or distortion, possibly EQ some more, maybe some compression, maybe some limiting. And yeah, you'll see that full process with quite a bit of experimentation involved. So here, just basically looking for a few bits and pieces to add a bit of interest to the sound. Just created a hi-hat out of one of the captures. And then EQing to make it sound more like a hi-hat, and obviously using the amp envelope to make it nice, tight and hat-like, and then just using a filter for a bit more beef there. As mentioned, we're going to cut out the side information in the lows, around kind of anywhere between 50 to 100 really. You don't need to stress too much about stereo in the lows, not as much nowadays anyway. It can sound pretty good, but with this particular source file being very stereo, this is definitely a good idea to put it in now. One downside of the Ableton EQ is that we can't shape the low pass or high passes. We just get two options. Sometimes it can sound a little bit unnatural. Do like Pro Q3 where possible. But yeah, just here we're searching for hunky frequencies and we're going to remove them. So the process of adding saturation, distortion, etc. can give very pleasing results, but it'll also exaggerate exaggerate certain frequencies, especially in the mids and the low mids. So yeah, quite a common process to EQ, saturate, distort, and then EQ again, and then maybe do that process several times to get something that we're completely happy with. So here we go, more saturation now, or distortion. This time using amp, but on a very low dry wet. Okay, so having done so much processing now, probably a good idea to bounce the kick to audio, and then we can get it on a MIDI track and start to do some more processing. Just really important to check your fades when you're doing that. Even when you consolidate an audio file, it will put a fade at the start unless you have that options turned off in the preferences. Kind of just starting the process again now, so got something that sounds like a kick that we're going to be happy with, and then just more experimentation with pitch and filter envelopes. setting up a sidechain here, making sure it's nice and short. And then here, we're going to add the MS2 filter type to simpler and then just give it a bit of drive, leaving the frequency at 30 Hz, just a touch of resonance and then a bit of drive, and that should really boost our fundamental. Then we are tuning. So opening up EQ8, you can see in the bottom left hand corner, it gives a readout of the pitch. So if we hover above the most part of the waveform, that should inform us of the pitch of our kick. Going to dive into some more EQ now, and again, there's no real right or wrong. You just want to spend a bit of time trying certain things out, seeing what works. As a general rule of thumb, we want to be cutting frequencies that can make our kick sound boxy and muddy, which are typically between 100 and 300 Hz. So you can see there's quite a tight notch there, just taking away some of the tonality. Tweaking the drum bus, really trying to get the sound that we want. Again, always important to gain stage. The limiter never does any harm in this kind of situation. Just be careful not to be doing too much gain reduction. Around -6 dB, it is quite a lot. So having the limiter set with a quick release and pumping quite significantly, it does actually alter the sound of the kick and the energy. So liking how that sounded, but ultimately that is probably a little bit too much in terms of the limiting, and we might lose the transient of our kick a little bit. So leave it on for now, but we're going to do more EQ. So you see this process again of EQ, saturation / distortion, and then more EQ again. The reason we've brought a compressor in at this point is to see if we can kind of get a similar sound that that limiter is giving us, and then using the compressor to squash the sound so we're not relying on the limiter so much. AB, make sure we're not adding too much gain to any of the processes. So just fine tuning it all now, making sure that we're not doing too much gain reduction, we're not adding too much gain at any stage, and just constantly turning things on and off, making sure that what it actually is sounds better. So reducing the knee there, that can be helpful to get a hard sounding kick. Again, checking the peak level on the channel, checking what's going out of the compressor, likewise with the limiter. So you see the gain reduction is less with the limiter now. more session admin. Really important to do, especially if in this kind of workflow where you've got loads of different samples just knocking around. Want to keep it all nice and tidy. So just going to make some effects parts now. This is just going to be like a hit on the first downbeat. So kind of percussion, kind of effects. That'll just kind of help underpin the beat. Using the handy Command E feature on the MIDI and just setting up a interesting MIDI pattern where it's not just every 16th note is the same length, and then adding some heavy sidechain compression. Again, remember this is sample from what we created, purely from the echo noise source and tons of modulation. Adding some redux here to try and fill up the very high end of the spectrum, introduce a bit more noise. Those two percussion pieces playing off each other quite nicely now. I'm going to add some saturation in terms of drum bus. Going to set up room reverb on a send, quite short reverb. Initially, basically setting up the algorithm side of the reverb here. Cutting out the lows. This tides feature can give kind of a harmonic feel. Obviously we need the dry wet up by 100%, and then we'll blend in some of the convolution. Quite often I'm setting up a room reverb like this and then sending my drums group to the reverb. The idea behind that is kind of traditional in terms of when you're recording a drum kit, it's all going to be in the same room. So essentially just kind of gives all your drums a bit of a space, and that very short reverb just gives a nice kind of warm melding of the sounds. it, we're setting up a dub style delay for the send. Notice that the first effect is 100% wet and the second one is actually just 30%. The key thing here on a send is that at least one of your processes is 100% wet, so we're not getting a doubling of the sound. So essentially we've got this ping pong delay on with one on the left and two on the right, going into another delay which is eighth dotted, quite a long feedback, and we're driving into that. Playing around with the feedback there, that could be a nice thing to automate during a break possibly. But as we've left it, very short feedback on the first one and a long feedback on the second one. And we just want to make sure we're cutting out the lows. Okay, so here we have quite an interesting creative process. I found an interesting section of audio from our recording. I've set it to slice, then to gate, and then I've put a arpeggiator before it. And now when we play, it cycles through some of the slices of our audio. And again, this is just kind of trial and error. Trying to figure something out that might work in the track, and just kind of playing around until you get something that you like. So yeah, I was happy with that, and then it's on to further sound design. Where we'll add a filter envelope. And you can see the process here, so quite a slow attack on the envelope and then mapping LFOs to get that filter envelope moving around. Adding redux and erosion here to get kind of a nice, noisy, sparkly top to our bass line, so that when that filter opens out, there's a bit more fizz over the top of it. Just session admin, mapping those LFO depth to a macro, and we can essentially turn that movement on and off. sound. We just want to keep that below 100 Hertz range free for the kick. So there's a little bit below 100 there. The cut is a bit closer to 80, but obviously there's a slope there, just making sure that our kick is going to be front and center. We're also going to drive some stuff into raw now, so taking out that low end before the saturation stage is going to give us a slightly cleaner or true sound, but we will be adding low end back in, so we're probably going to want to EQ after this also. Just diving back into the kick here, essentially we've added a new part and we want to make sure that there's going to be room for that, so I've scooped a little bit more out of the kick in that kind of range that the bass is now taking up. Ultimately ended up with a little bit of a strange EQ shape here, but again, just kind of trust your ears, go with it, go with whatever works. So here we have a piece of audio that's looped to 2 bars, and then we're using just the clip gain envelope to create a little repeating sweeper, adding a nice bit of interest into the beat. So just quickly returning to our percussion here, we have quite a nice varied pattern anyway, because we're using 3 different chops of the audio that are set up differently. What we've done here is right click the decay, mapped it to a macro, and then mapped sibling. So the decay of all the samples in that drum rack are going to be affected by that macro, and we are then adding an LFO to that macro, essentially giving a little bit of random movement to the decay of the sound. You can hear it's kind of shuffly, gets that human feel. And then we can set up the LFO to be random and on 16th notes, so every hit we will get a slightly different value, just keeping the loop a bit more interesting. We set up an effect before and it's got a quite nice ringing to it, but it's a little bit strong, so just cut out the fundamental there with a very sharp IQ band. Looking for our melodic parts now, or more musical parts I should say. Basically the stuff that went through a resonator, so it's got a bit more of a tone, and we should be able to make a nice chord hit out of this. So at first we're just using a long piece of audio, and again using the clip gain envelopes just to add some kind of like throw effects of the sound. And then we'll use some delay and probably add it into a send as well for a nice kind of atmospheric sound there. Okay, so during the recording, we accidentally recorded a classic horn sound, and as much as I knew this was most likely going to sound cheesy, I could not help but utilise this sound. Again, one of the wonderful serendipitous things about doing this kind of sound design is the weird happy accidents that come up. And yeah, it's a pretty faithful recreation of classic foghorn. So the idea was to get this in, make it interesting without it sounding obviously like a horn and sounding cheesy. So at this point we just want to add a bit more groove, so we're just going to grab some top loops from Driving Techno Essentials. So quite often when using loops, I am using this technique of warp mode beats, preserve transients, and then go to the one sideways arrow pointing to the right. This is essentially a transient designer for the sustain, and you can make the loop shorter. And it works really well for layering different loops on top of each other. But this one, purposely, we're looking for kind of a bit more mid-range and a bit of movement in that area. Earlier on in the session, I went and grabbed one of the chord sections, part where we were pushing it into the resonators. I've gone over to the arrangement view, consolidated a clip, and now we've added it into Granulator 3. And again, trial and error, jump into some sound design, have a little play around. Remove the lows. The high boost is not something that you'd typically do for this kind of sound. I'm just working with the audio that I've got and feeling like it needs more high end, so being quite brave there, pushing it up. And then yeah, it's just about playing around really, seeing what works. Deciding to group all of my kind of synth elements together, and then I am adding a saturator to the group. Going for the sine old fold option, which is, I believe, some kind of emulation of tape saturation, so should just give our synths a bit more kind of warmth and crispiness. This is going to be the main hook of our song really, so quite important to get this right and cutting through the mix. As it is, it's not quite there, so we're going to add some saturation / distortion. Let's go with the amp on this occasion. is loaded, the dry wet is automatically on 0 and the output is on dual. I would recommend just setting this up, right clicking and then saving that as your preset. So on the rock setting there, the presence down quite a bit and just a 16% dry wet, and then add into a reverb send. More shaping here with the filter, and happy with how this sound is finally coming together now. Finally getting on to group processing of the drums now. This is really what can bring drum groups to life, is the processing of all the sounds together. So straight away we've gone in the saturator, hard curve mode, no drive, 18% wet, but that still needs compensating on the output. Turn it down by -4. We've addressed some of the mid-honky frequencies with a bit of EQ. Those frequencies probably brought out a little bit more by the saturation, so just tucking them in there. Again, just double checking that all our processes aren't adding too much gain, if any at all, before moving onto the compression. Gain reduction of around 5, so we want our makeup around the same figure, and we can create a bit of loudness and more of a squashed feeling by reducing the range here. And then once again into to a limiter. Worth noting, from memory, I think I replaced this limiter with FabFilter Pro L2 towards the end stages. The Ableton limiter is fine, but I do find Pro L2 a little bit more user-friendly and a little bit more transparent and clear in terms of the end result. For one final A/B with the drum processing. So without adding too much gain, we've made it sound a bit more punchy, a bit more bright, a bit more clear. Like I say, a different limiter on the end might be more beneficial. Here, in terms of bringing our mix together, on the synth group, I'm setting a limiter with a ceiling of -14, and you see how it's only just tickling there a little bit, so just a tiny bit of gain reduction, kind of just chopping it off at -14, making sure there's no signal going over that, which should kind of control how much we're letting through into the master. So I find if your drum group is at around -8 and your synth's at around -14, you're probably going to end up with a fairly decent level on your master, so somewhere around -6 dB. Obviously, depending on what other elements you might have in, you might have to adjust those figures. So just jumping back here into, again, pre-EQ before the group saturation. Having done that saturation on the group, I felt like I could improve the sound of the kick with just a little small EQ tweak. So just essentially sketching out a breakdown in my head here, so just using the low pass on the EQ8 and then playing around with the sends of the chord stab, just kind of building up an idea for a break in my head. And we have, I would say, the majority of what we're going to need for a track here. Just some final tweaks and checking over, and then we will record into the session view, and then in the next video we will go through a little bit more of the mixing and arrangement process. So just some final tweaking here of the drum group. I've selected all channels within the drum group and turned them down slightly so we're not hitting that limiter so hard. So I hope you found this video helpful, useful, informative. If you did, please give us a like, please subscribe, and ring the notification bell to be notified of when the next video comes out, where we will be looking at arrangement and mixing. Cheers, bye now.
And decipher mode out from there 3 times.
And in the future.
Yes, and in the past. That's where I just came from not more than 2 weeks ago.
Why did they transport you